May 1945. The world was exhaling a collective breath of relief as the fires of World War II began to flicker out. Berlin was a skeleton of its former self, and the Allied forces were sweeping through the heart of Europe. But while thousands were surrendering, a shadow was moving in the opposite direction, deep into the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Bavarian Alps. Among those shadows was Colonel Hans von Scholl, a high-ranking SS officer known not for his battlefield heroics, but for his expertise in special logistics. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a heavy, iron-bound briefcase and a secret that was never meant to survive the collapse. Von Scholl was last seen at a remote checkpoint near Mittenwald. Witnesses, few as they were, described a man who looked remarkably calm for someone whose world was ending. He pulled up in a dark staff car, dismissed his driver with a final, cryptic command, and began a solo ascent into the clouds. The last official record of his existence is a signature on a supply manifest, 2 weeks' worth of high-altitude rations, a shortwave radio, and a single-shot flare gun. He walked into the white mist of a late-season blizzard and simply evaporated. For 79 years, the case of Hans von Scholl remained one of history's most frustrating voids. There were no sightings in South America, no records of his capture in Soviet archives, and no remains found in the melting glaciers. He became a ghost, a campfire story for local hikers, the officer of the ridge, who supposedly watched the valleys from above. But in the digital age, secrets have a new enemy. It isn't a team of mountain rangers or a group of historians. It's a satellite orbiting 400 miles above the Earth's surface. The breakthrough didn't happen in a dusty archive. It happened in a suburban bedroom in 2024. A digital hobbyist, obsessed with mapping unrecorded structures in the Alps using Google Earth's highest resolution historical layer, noticed something. Near a ridge that was officially listed as inaccessible terrain, there was a geometric anomaly. It was too sharp for a rock, too deliberate for a landslide. Under a specific angle of the morning sun, the satellite had captured the shadow of a chimney, a stone structure perfectly camouflaged to match the surrounding limestone. This wasn't just a shepherd's hut. This was located at an altitude where no one lived, near a pass that didn't exist on any modern map. When the coordinates were cross-referenced with declassified 1940s aerial surveillance, the anomaly matched a Project X fallback site mentioned in only one redacted memo. The digital community erupted. Could this be it? Could the tomb of Hans von Scholl have been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very terrain that made it a fortress? But as the first drone team was dispatched to the site, they realized why the mountain had kept this secret for so long. The hideout wasn't just built on the mountain, it was built into it. And as the drone's infrared camera scanned the structure, it picked up something that made the operators freeze. Inside the 79-year-old stone walls, something was still generating heat. A faint, rhythmic pulse that defied all logic. The ghost of the ridge wasn't just a legend. The hideout was occupied, and the heavy iron-bound briefcase von Scholl had carried into the mist was about to be opened for the first time in nearly a century. What lay inside that cabin wasn't just a body. It was a countdown. And the modern world was about to realize that some wars don't end with a treaty. They simply wait for the clouds to clear. The drone's thermal feed sent a ripple of disbelief through the small research base camp established 5 miles below the ridge. A rhythmic heat signature in a structure that had been isolated since the fall of the Third Reich was a scientific impossibility. It was too steady to be a wild animal and too faint to be a modern heating system. It was as if the mountain itself had developed a heartbeat. Dr. Elena Vance, the lead historical investigator, knew that satellite images and drone feeds could only tell half the story. To understand what Hans von Scholl had done, they had to breach the Alpine Hideout in person. The ascent was a nightmare of frozen shale and narrow ledges that crumbled under the slightest pressure. Von Scholl had chosen his sanctuary with a strategist's eye. The cabin was tucked into a natural amphitheater of rock that shielded it from the wind and, more importantly, from the eyes of Allied reconnaissance planes. As the team reached the final plateau, 9,000 feet above sea level, the structure finally emerged from the mist. It was a marvel of camouflage, built from the same gray limestone as the surrounding peaks, with a roof covered in native lichen and moss. "It's not a cabin," whispered one of the mountaineers. "It's a bunker disguised as a home." The front door was made of heavy Austrian oak, reinforced with steel plates that showed surprisingly little rust for nearly 8 decades of exposure. But as Dr. Vance approached, she noticed the first chilling detail. The door wasn't barred from the outside by decades of snow or debris. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently stepped out or was inviting them in. As they pushed the door open, the interior revealed a level of preservation that felt unnatural. The air inside wasn't stagnant or damp. It was dry and carried a faint scent of pine resin and old paper. The walls were lined with thick wool blankets, and in the corner sat a small, custom-made potbelly stove. This was the source of the heat, not a fire, but a primitive geothermal pipe system that tapped into a volcanic thermal vent deep within the mountain, a rare geological feature that von Scholl must have known about before he vanished. On a small wooden table in the center of the room sat a single plate, a fork, and a tin cup. Beside them lay a map of the world, not the world of 1945, but a map that had been meticulously updated by hand. Strange ink markings traced the development of the Cold War, the rise of nuclear states, and the expansion of global surveillance. It became terrifyingly clear von Scholl hadn't been hiding in a state of suspended animation. He had been a silent observer, a watcher on the peak, tracking the movements of the world he had left behind. But the most disturbing discovery was the radio. It wasn't the clunky shortwave unit from 1945. It was a sophisticated array of vacuum tubes and hand wound coils, connected to a long wire antenna that ran hundreds of feet up the mountain peak. The dials were glowing. The unit was receiving a signal. Dr. Vance picked up a pair of heavy Bakelite headphones. At first, there was only the hiss of static, the sound of the void. But then, a voice broke through, not a recording, but a live broadcast in a coded language that had been dead for 70 years. The voice was reciting coordinates, and as Vance tracked them on the map, her heart skipped a beat. The coordinates weren't for military bases or historical sites. They were for modern-day data centers and satellite hubs. In the corner of the room, behind a heavy curtain, they found the SS officer's uniform. It was hung neatly on a rack, pristine and unweathered. But the man who should have been wearing it was nowhere to be seen. Instead, on the floor beneath the uniform, lay the iron-bound briefcase. It was open. Inside the briefcase wasn't gold or documents. It was filled with hundreds of small, glass slides, each containing microscopic etchings of names, addresses, and bank account numbers. This was the special logistics von Scholl had been tasked with. He wasn't just a soldier. He was the keeper of a shadow ledger, a list of assets and individuals who had been moved into the fabric of the post-war world to wait for a signal. Suddenly, the radio signal changed. The voice stopped, and a series of sharp, rhythmic pulses filled the room. The geothermal stove hissed, and the floor began to vibrate. Beneath the cabin, the team realized there was a second level, a deeper vault that Google Earth could never have seen. And from that vault, the sound of a heavy mechanical elevator beginning its slow, grinding ascent could be heard. The Alpine Hideout wasn't just a home for a ghost. It was a gateway. And whoever, or whatever, was coming up from the depths had been waiting 79 years for someone to open that front door. The grinding sound of the mechanical elevator echoed through the small stone cabin, vibrating the very floorboards the team stood on. Dr. Vance and her crew backed away from the center of the room as a section of the floor, expertly disguised as simple planks, began to descend into a dark, vertical shaft. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a concealed entrance to a much larger subterranean complex. The Alpine hideout seen on Google Earth was merely the tip of an iceberg, a perch designed to monitor the skies while the real work happened deep within the mountain's granite heart. As the elevator platform returned to the surface, it didn't bring a person. It brought a massive, pressurized canister made of lead and steel, marked with the same Project X designation they had seen in the declassified memos. Beside it sat a modern, high-grade satellite uplink terminal that looked completely out of place in a 1945 bunker. The juxtaposition was jarring. 1940s heavy engineering connected to 21st century microelectronics. He wasn't just watching, Dr. Vance whispered, her flashlight beam reflecting off the polished surface of the terminal. He was communicating. The team followed the elevator shaft down using a secondary emergency ladder. 30 feet below the cabin, the mountain opened up into a cavernous, man-made hall. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of filing cabinets, but these weren't filled with paper. They were filled with magnetic reels and primitive computer punch cards, organized with obsessive precision. This was the central archive of the Shadow Ledger. As they explored the hall, they found a living quarters that looked as if it had been occupied until very recently. A fresh loaf of bread, remarkably not moldy, sat on a counter next to a modern laptop that was plugged into the bunker's geothermal power source. This was the ultimate proof. The SS Officer Hans von Scholl hadn't just survived the war. He, or someone following his exact protocols, had maintained this station into the present day. Dr. Vance approached the laptop. The screen was active, displaying a global map with hundreds of flickering blue dots. Each dot corresponded to a location from the glass slides found in the briefcase upstairs. As she watched, one of the dots in London turned from blue to red, then another in New York, then one in Zurich. The dots, they aren't people, the team's tech specialist remarked, his fingers flying over the keyboard. They're deadman switches. These are financial accounts and shell companies that have remained dormant for nearly 80 years. Someone just activated them. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Hans von Scholl's special logistics wasn't about moving stolen art or gold. It was about moving influence. By burying the Shadow Ledger in the Alps and maintaining a silent watch, he had ensured that a specific network of power could survive the post-war purges and wait for the world to become sufficiently digital, sufficiently connected, and sufficiently vulnerable. Deep in the archive, they found the general's personal office. Behind his desk hung a massive portrait, but it wasn't of any political leader. It was a painting of the Alpine peaks they were currently standing inside, titled Der Wachter, the Guardian. Beneath the painting sat a safe. Using a combination found in the back of the radio logbook, Dr. Vance opened it. Inside was a single reel of 16mm film and a handwritten letter dated 2024. The letter wasn't written in the shaky hand of a centenarian. It was precise, cold, and written in modern German. It read, "The satellite era has gifted us what the radar era could not. We no longer need to hide our location. We only need to hide our intent. The signal has been sent. The ledger is live." Suddenly, the monitors in the room began to scroll through thousands of names. Names of CEOs, politicians, and high-ranking military officials from around the world. These were the descendants of the Shadow Ledger, the sleeper agents of a network that had been self-sustaining for 3 generations. Just then, the bunker's internal alarm began to howl. Not the high-pitched siren of a modern alarm, but the deep, guttural mechanical wail of a 1940s air raid siren. The Shadow Ledger had detected the intrusion. The team looked at the elevator. It was moving again, but this time, it was being called from the surface. Someone was coming down, and they weren't coming to talk history. They were coming to protect the ledger. The mechanical wail of the air raid siren felt like a physical weight, vibrating against the stone walls and rattling the glass slides in the archive. Dr. Vance and her team stood frozen for a split second as the elevator platform began its slow, heavy ascent toward the surface cabin. Someone had triggered a remote command, and the bunker, once a tomb, was now a functioning machine of war. "We need to block that shaft," the tech specialist shouted, but it was too late. The gears were locked into an automated cycle. As the team scrambled to find an exit, Dr. Vance's flashlight caught a hidden door behind the rows of magnetic reels. Unlike the rest of the bunker, which was made of rough-hewn stone and industrial steel, this door was modern, an airtight, pressurized vault door with a digital keypad. Beside it was a small biometric scanner. This was the entrance to the communications hub, the brain of the Alpine Hideout. Realizing their time was running out, Dr. Vance used the laptop she had found earlier to bypass the keypad. As the vault door hissed open, they stepped into a room that looked more like a NASA control center than a World War II bunker. High-definition screens lined the walls, displaying live feeds from what appeared to be secure government buildings across Europe and North America. This was the Alpine Eye. Hans von Scholl hadn't just been hiding. He had built a parallel intelligence agency. By tapping into the trans-European fiber-optic cables that ran through the mountain passes nearby, the network had been intercepting global data for decades. The Shadow Ledger wasn't just a list of names. It was a real-time blackmail and influence engine. "Look at the dates," Vance whispered, pointing to a log on the central console. The most recent entry was time-stamped only 10 minutes ago. It was a command sent to a server in Frankfurt. "Initiate Protocol 79. Protocol 79. The exact number of years since von Scholl had disappeared. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a timer. The discovery of the bunker via Google Earth hadn't been an accident. It was the final trigger. The network wanted to be found, but only when they were ready to move their assets from the shadows into the light. Suddenly, the video feeds on the wall changed. They no longer showed buildings. They showed the cabin above. Through the drone's abandoned camera, they saw 3 black, unmarked helicopters hovering over the ridge. Men in tactical gear, bearing no insignia, were rappelling down onto the plateau. These weren't historians or government officials. These were the Sentinels, the private security force of the Shadow Ledger. "They aren't here to capture us," the tech specialist said, his voice trembling as he watched the tactical team plant thermal charges on the cabin's foundation. "They're here to erase the evidence." The team realized the horrifying truth. The Alpine Hideout was a self-destructing node. Now that the ledger had been digitally transferred to a secondary location, this physical site was a liability. The Sentinels were going to bury the bunker, the records, and the researchers under thousands of tons of alpine rock. Dr. Vance turned back to the console, desperately searching for a way out. She found a schematic of the mountain. There was a secondary exit, a ventilation flue that exited nearly a mile away, disguised as a natural crevice in the rock face. But to reach it, they had to cross the oxygen processing room, a part of the bunker that hadn't been opened since 1945. As they ran toward the back of the vault, the first explosion rocked the mountain. The ceiling groaned, and dust began to rain down. The elevator shaft, their only easy way out, had been collapsed. They were now a mile deep inside a mountain that was being systematically brought down on top of them. In the flickering emergency lights, Vance saw a final photo pinned to the wall near the exit. It was a group photo taken in the 1970s. In the center was a middle-aged man who looked exactly like Hans von Scholl, standing next to a prominent world leader. The caption read, "The son continues what the father began." The war hadn't ended in 1945. It had just changed its uniform. And as the second explosion hit, closer this time, Dr. Vance knew they had to survive, not just to save their lives, but to tell the world that the Shadow Ledger was no longer a secret. It was now in control. The second explosion was followed by a silence more terrifying than the blast itself. The Alpine Eye surveillance room went dark, the flickering screens replaced by the dim, red glow of emergency battery power. Dust filled the air, thick and tasting of pulverized limestone. Dr. Vance and her team were now cut off from the surface, buried deep within a mountain that was being converted into their tomb by the sentinels above. The ventilation flew. Vance coughed, pointing her flashlight toward the heavy, circular hatch at the end of the corridor. "It's our only exit left." They reached the door to the oxygen processing room. This was the heart of the bunker's life support system, a marvel of 1940s engineering designed to keep a small crew alive for years without ever surfacing. As they turned the heavy iron wheel, the door groaned open, revealing a forest of rusted pipes, massive bellows, and chemical scrubbers. But as their lights swept across the room, they realized they weren't alone. Slumped against a copper oxygen tank was a figure. It was a man, dressed in the heavy wool uniform of a 1940s German soldier. His skin was like gray parchment, his eyes closed. But he wasn't a skeleton. The low oxygen, high-pressure environment of the sealed room had mummified him perfectly. This was the final sentinel, the man Hans von Scholl had left behind to ensure the machinery never failed. In his lap sat a leather-bound logbook. Dr. Vance carefully pulled it away. The final entries weren't about air pressure or fuel levels. They were personal. Day 1460, the entry read, "The world below thinks the fire is out. They do not know we are the embers. The colonel's son visited today via the secret lift. He brings news of the digital frontier. We are no longer building a Reich of land, but a Reich of information. My watch is almost over. The next generation is already in place." Vance realized with horror that the Shadow Ledger wasn't just a list of names they had found in the archive. It was a biological and ideological succession. The network had used this bunker as a baptismal site for decades, bringing the descendants of the original officers here to swear their allegiance in the presence of their ancestors. Suddenly, a high-pitched hiss filled the room. The explosions had ruptured the ancient oxygen tanks. The air was becoming volatile. "We have to move now," Vance shouted. They scrambled over the rusted machinery toward the ventilation shaft. It was a narrow, vertical chimney lined with iron rungs. As they climbed, they could hear the muffled thuds of more explosions above. The sentinels were systematically collapsing the mountain's veins. Halfway up the shaft, the tech specialist stopped, his flashlight pointed at a junction box. "Wait, this isn't just a vent." He pulled back a metal plate to reveal a cluster of modern, glowing fiber optic cables. "This is the main nerve. This is how the ledger is being broadcast to the world right now. If I cut this, we stop Protocol 79. If you cut that, the Sentinels will know exactly where we are," Vance warned. "They'll drop a charge right down this vent." "If I don't," the specialist replied, his hand trembling over the cable, "the Shadow Ledger becomes the new global operating system. Every bank, every intelligence agency, Every power grid will have a backdoor owned by von Scholl's descendants. Before Vance could respond, the radio on her belt, the one they had taken from the hideout upstairs, crackled to life. It wasn't the coded voice from before. It was a calm, cultured voice speaking in perfect English. Dr. Vance, I presume? You've been very persistent. But you were trying to stop a sunrise. The Alpine hideout was never a prison for the past. It was a laboratory for the future. My father spent 30 years in that mountain to ensure that when the world finally connected itself, we would be the ones holding the wires. Cutting that cable won't stop us. We are already everywhere. The voice paused, then added with a chilling finality. Sentinel Team 4, target the North Flue. Terminate the intrusion. A split second later, the team heard a metallic clink from far above. Something small and heavy was tumbling down the shaft, bouncing off the iron rungs. Jump! Vance screamed. The metallic clink of the grenade hitting the rungs echoed like a death knell. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, Dr. Vance and her team didn't jump down. They lunged into a horizontal maintenance crawl space just as the explosion ripped through the vertical shaft. The shockwave slammed into them, a wall of heat and dust that threatened to crush their lungs, but the narrow stone tunnel held. Behind them, the ventilation shaft, their only way out, was now a chimney of fire and falling debris. They were trapped in the intermediate zone, a section of the mountain that appeared on no map. The cables, the tech specialist gasped, his face covered in soot. I managed to sever the primary uplink before the blast. Protocol 79 is stalled, but not killed. They crawled forward through the pitch-black tunnel, guided only by the dying light of Vance's flashlight. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a natural cavern. But this wasn't a cave. It was a high-tech server farm cooled by the natural alpine ice. Thousands of tiny blue lights flickered in the dark, the true brain of the shadow ledger. In the center of the room sat a single, modern chair facing a wall of glass. Beyond the glass was a breathtaking view of the valley below, hidden by a one-way cloaking screen. And sitting in that chair, waiting for them, was a man who looked barely 40 years old, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit. "Welcome to the top of the world," the man said, standing up. The resemblance to the mummified soldier below was haunting, but his eyes were sharp with modern ambition. "I am Marcus von Scholl, and you are the first outsiders to see the new world order before it goes live." "It's over, Marcus," Vance said, her voice shaking but firm. "We've seen the ledger. We know about the sleeper agents. The world will know." Marcus laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The world? Dr. Vance, the world is currently experiencing a global sync error. While you were climbing my mountain, our software was being integrated into every major financial update. You didn't stop Protocol 79. You just forced us to use the backup satellite." He pointed to a screen. It showed the Google Earth image that had started it all. "Did you really think a satellite accidentally caught a glimpse of this cabin? We leaked that image. We needed a breach to justify the final activation. We needed you to trigger the sensors so we could claim we were under attack and move our assets to the next phase." Suddenly, the floor hummed. A hidden hangar door at the far end of the cavern began to slide open, revealing a sleek, VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, craft. The Sentinels hadn't come to kill Marcus. They had come to extract him. "The Alpine hideout has served its purpose," Marcus said, walking toward the craft. "The ghost of my father can finally rest. The Reich of Information doesn't need a mountain. It lives in the cloud now. You can stay here and watch the sunset. It's the last one the old world will ever see." As Marcus boarded the craft, the tech specialist lunged for the main server console. "If I can't stop the upload, I can at least tag the data. I can leave a digital breadcrumb that every antivirus on Earth will recognize. His fingers flew across the keys as the VTOL's engines roared to life. The hangar was filling with freezing Alpine air. With one final keystroke, he hit enter. Done, he whispered. The ledger is tagged. They can hide the names, but they can't hide the signature. The craft roared out of the mountain, disappearing into the clouds. Seconds later, a series of massive, final charges detonated throughout the base. The mountain began to scream as the granite supports finally gave way. Vance and her team ran toward the open hangar ledge. It was a 200-foot drop into a snowbank. Jump, Vance cried, and this time there was no other choice. Weeks later, the world remained in a state of digital chaos. Banks reported ghost transactions, and several high-ranking officials resigned without explanation. The official report stated that a natural landslide had destroyed a remote research site in the Alps. No bodies were found, but in a small office in London, Dr. Elena Vance received an anonymous email. It contained no text, only a single image, a high-resolution satellite shot of a remote farm in South America. In the corner of the field, partially hidden by a jungle canopy, was a familiar sight, a small, stone chimney, and a bright red 3D arrow pointing directly at it. The shadow ledger had moved, and the watch had begun again.